I think Americans need to understand that there is an international market for arms. And Ukraine has been a blessing to the international arms market because organizations, terrorist organizations, criminal organizations that want to gain access to military quality weaponry are in that market. Now, some of these things end up being sold down in Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Other things end up in different places. But the point is that once you deliver, let us say 50 AK-47s or 50 machine guns of some kind or assault rifles, you have to reckon in Ukraine that maybe as much as half of it will disappear into the shadows. And then they end up in places like Mexico. Mexico's not the only one. They end up in places in Central Africa, wherever there's conflict, wherever there's a need for it. And we have people on film down in Mexico walking around with Javelin missiles on their backs. So we know the stuff has reached the cartels, and the cartels are flush with cash. So it's a great business for criminals.
Okay. Yeah, the Russia-Ukraine war is something that you and I have covered together for about 3 years now. I read that Ukraine is ready for a ceasefire. Russia responded, "We don't want a ceasefire. We want lasting peace." How do we get there in your mind with Trump in America wanting the war to end, but leaders in Europe wanting this war to continue?
I think there are several things that we need to do. First of all, whatever the Europeans are saying, and at this point, the only two states who've said that they really want to send troops to Western Ukraine under certain circumstances, presumably as peacekeepers or more than combatants, are Great Britain and France. Both of them have very small forces. The populations in those countries do not support the commitment of ground forces in Ukraine for any particular purpose. The governments are very weak. I don't think that they will last. In fact, I think they'll be gone within the next 6 to 12 months. The second thing is the Europeans cannot undertake anything of substance without us. And if President Trump simply says, you're a sovereign state, Great Britain, you're a sovereign state, France, if this is a decision you want to make, and this is something you want to do, you are certainly free to do it, but you will do it without any help or assistance from us. Because our number one goal is not just peace in Ukraine. Our number one goal is to normalize relations with Russia, to get to a position where we can do business with each other without fear of interference from the usual suspects on the Hill who are busy trying to create sanctions and impose measures of a penal nature on Russia. We want to get out of this vicious, endless cycle of Russia hatred and Russia paranoia. It's stupid. It's unnecessary. I know President Trump wants to get past that. So how do you get there from here? The Russians have said for a very long time, at least over the last 2 years repeatedly, they're not interested in a ceasefire. Why do they not have an interest in a ceasefire? Because from their standpoint, the ceasefire just buys time for the Ukrainians to rest, refit, and potentially find more weapons with which to attack Russia. That's not their interest. They've said, we're happy to negotiate while we continue to fight. And then we can look at what is possible. But we're not going to sign on for a ceasefire. And the worst part of this is that we're offering a ceasefire on behalf of Ukraine when President Trump has turned around and said, I'm resuming military aid to Ukraine. Well, why would you resume aid to this regime that you are trying to push into peace if you're serious about peace? It makes absolutely no sense. And I've said for months that the precondition is very simple. End all forms of military aid immediately. That involves intelligence sharing, anything. And then secondly, withdraw our technical support. People in Ukraine who are in uniform, out of uniform, intelligence, doesn't make any difference. All American citizens get out. Now, why is that important? Because that's a clear signal to Ukraine that we're not supporting you anymore. if you're going to try and fight this, you're on your own. The moment you do that, Ukrainians will cease and desist, Stephen. They can't operate on their own for very long. And the Russians know this. And I think the Russians are really perplexed by our behavior because they do believe that President Trump is sincere, but his actions don't support that sincerity. So I think there's a lot of confusion and incoherence right now in the conduct of our foreign and defense policy.
Okay. I, for one, thought it was great when he cut off the intelligence, the aid, the equipment. I was shocked to see him resume so quickly. My only thought was, okay, his first impeachment came from Democrats not liking the way he behaved with Zelensky and Ukraine. Could that play a role in not wanting to get caught up in another impeachment? Do you think he's under a lot of pressure from the NATO leaders? I guess I don't understand why he resumed.
I think that people probably told him, if you do not resume this, then you have no bargaining chip at the game, at the gaming table. You see, these people think that they're dealing with some sort of gambling operation. You've heard people say, well, you don't hold the cards. What are your cards? And so forth. That's bad juju, frankly. We're talking about a very serious conflict that has always had the potential to spin out of control and involve more European states in it. That is not over. As long as the fighting lasts, that potential to spin out of control is quite real. So we need to stop talking in those terms. Secondly, we have no leverage. Only leverage we have is with the Ukrainians. And that's why the Russians look at us and say, if you want to end this, remove this government, get this man Zelensky out. To pretend that Zelensky is an independent operator, that somehow or another he miraculously showed up without any influence from us, is absurd. He's there because the people that we put on the ground in Ukraine that installed this government in 2014 wanted him to be there. We made the deals with the various oligarchs to pick him up, this former actor, and install him as the president of Ukraine. Now, he's long since outlived his usefulness, let's put it that way, to us as a puppet. So let's get rid of him, be done with it. And the other thing is, we could hold elections in that country. If we're serious, we could invite the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe in, let them monitor this, and pick a new government. We could also find people in Ukraine who are willing to serve in an interim government, who are not committed to this endless war, because Zelensky and his friends are committed to it. They're in a position that's, frankly, not very different from Netanyahu. The moment they sign on for peace, they're finished. The moment Netanyahu says, okay, we're stopping, he's finished. That's the problem. So getting them out is necessary. We have the instrumentalities to do that. I'm not talking about assassinating the man per se, but we can remove him and we can end this phony government in Kyiv.
I had read that Trump was hopeful that there would be elections in Ukraine, that they could bring somebody else in. Do you think that the Zelensky White House blowup that happened 10 days ago or so, do you believe that that was a setup in order to pressure Trump and the United States into giving more money to the war? Or do you think that that was a natural misunderstanding?
Well, first of all, I don't know. I know that the individual responsible for the meeting was Secretary of State Rubio. And Secretary of State Rubio is a newcomer to the peace initiative. He has always supported all of the warlike measures. He is very much part of the neocon community. He set it up. Now, did he know that Zelensky was going to come in and behave that way? I have no idea. But it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing to us. It was embarrassing to the people of Ukraine, which this man claims to represent. I have never accepted that truth. I think the Ukrainians want an end to this war. They don't support it. And the sooner we end it, the better for Ukraine. Ukraine is now a dying state, effectively. And no one seems to care in Washington. They're simply seen as useful for the purpose of continuing the war on the assumption, which is totally false, that this somehow harms Russia. On the other hand, we can make the argument that Russia has never been stronger, more cohesive, more militarily capable than it is today. And that's largely a result of the war that we have been waging on the backs of Ukraine.
I also read that President Trump has said he might pull U.S. troops out of Germany, shift them over to countries more like Poland and Hungary that are more aligned with what America wants. What would be the purpose of that? Is that something that might happen?
I don't know. That's a new one on me. My experience with President Trump is that he wanted a gradual disengagement of U.S. forces from Europe, and for that matter, in Northeast Asia and many parts of the world. He wants partners, allies, to be their own first responders. And that's completely legitimate in my view, especially since this is 80 years after the Second World War, and certainly 30 years plus after the dissolution of the Soviet state system and the Warsaw Pact. Why are we continuing to behave on the ground, in the air, at sea, as though nothing has changed? And I think that's what privately President Trump thinks, and I agree with him 100%. So I don't know where this came from. Perhaps that was just a backhanded way of rejecting German attitudes. I have no idea. But the point is, at this stage, I think it's irrelevant. I think there's an interest in diffusing this crisis, and it is still a crisis, and getting it over with. And the way you do that is not by moving forces further east into Hungary on the border with Ukraine.
Okay. As they start to have negotiations with Putin, do you think that Trump will have to pull personnel, military equipment, money support, intelligence out of Ukraine as a show to Putin that he's serious about ending this war?
I think we have an interest for fiscal reasons and strategic reasons to largely withdraw the American military establishment from the European continent. I think that's clear. We have bigger fish to fry here at home. We have to make spending cuts. Defense is the largest single portion of discretionary spending. What do you do in defense when you cut it? You cut from the outside in. You reduce your overseas presence, and you bring forces back, and you shrink your budget accordingly. So that's one thing that we want to do, regardless of all the other issues. And yes, I think it's very important that we understand that the Russians, from the very beginning, go back and look at the proposals they submitted in December of 2021, before the war began. And they were looking for a larger solution that involved restoring confidence measures. In other words, dictating in advance where forces would go and when they would go, how many would go, and whether or not there would be observers there from Russia, from NATO, and so forth. That's something we ought to go back to. I don't know that we can at this stage, because I don't know that Europe is prepared for all of that. I think, truthfully, the European populations have to go to the polls. They have to signal their rejection of all of these previous policies. I think that's going to happen. I think it's begun, but I think it's going to have to go further. And frankly, there's not that much we can do to influence it, except to do, as I said earlier, President Trump simply needs to say, look, we don't want this war. And if you are going to insist on perpetuating this conflict, you're going to do it on your own, because that is not in the interest of the United States. We don't think it's in the interest of Europe.
Yeah. I mean, I take President Trump at his word when he says he wants this to end. Just within the last couple days, he was with the Prime Minister of Ireland, and the Ukraine war came up, and he said 2,500 young people died just last week. Like, we've got to end this. I know that even though he's not Ukrainian, it seems to really weigh on him that every week that goes by is thousands of more humans dead. That really does seem to bother him. Speaking of that, I have to imagine that you are on Ukraine's kill list for openly talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. I'm on that kill list. Alex Jones has posited this week that the journalist at InfoWars that was killed could have been related to Ukraine. He's now saying General Michael Flynn and others high up are warning him to get security, that there is communique and chatter about Zelensky and Ukraine coming after journalists in America. Any truth to that? Is this possibly just paranoia?
I think we have to treat the threat seriously. The problem, of course, is that most of us cannot afford private security. So most of us should be armed and prepared. And I certainly am. That's a foregone conclusion. So it may be possible to kill me, but it won't be easy. Let's put it that way. Now, how serious is the threat? I think it's very serious, seriously directed at President Trump. That's my greatest concern. And I hope the FBI and the Secret Service are taking it seriously, because most of these Ukrainian operatives and people that are capable of assassinating people, they are in Northern Virginia. They're concentrated there. They've been working closely with the CIA. So I think that's where we need to focus right now. The president's security is number one. As for the rest of us, we need to be mindful. We need to be alert and consider the possibility that however insignificant we may be for some reason, some Ukrainian nationalist out there sees benefit in killing us.
Okay. Whew. All right. Let's talk about a domestic issue. I read this morning, Judge Tanya Chutkan of Washington, D.C., the judge that oversaw the January 6th case about Trump, has now ordered that the personal information of Elon Musk's Doge team be made public. She's essentially legally doxing them. Is this so that Democrats and activists can go and harass these people and their families? Why would they order the public release of all of their information?
I think we have to understand, Stephen, that we are not simply a divided country. What I would call the committed left, which does involve, sadly, for reasons of monetary benefit, large numbers of so-called rhinos on the Hill, that cabal is at war with us. In other words, they are genuinely interested in the destruction of Americans like you and me. We have to be frank about it. And they do have great reach. They're extremely well financed. They're not financed necessarily by entities overseas. They're financed by people within the United States. So I think that's what we have to come to terms with. We are divided, and one side is in open war with us. And they have their disciples, their adherents, whatever you want to call them, in the judiciary system. And they will ignore the law. They will ignore what is right. They will ignore the Bill of Rights. Those things carry no weight with them. Now, some people say that's because they're Marxists. That may be. I don't think it's necessarily a Marxist ideology. I just think it's an ideology of hatred for us. And they will use the levers of power to whatever extent they want to and need to harm us. That's a reality. One of the reasons that I think President Trump was elected to office was to address that. And he's got to. And he's going to need a lot of help from the Justice Department. So I think Kash Patel has a very important role to play in that connection. So does Bongino. I don't know whether or not he's been confirmed. And obviously Ratcliffe. These people have got to take an interest in what's happening and put an end to it. Because the government should not be weaponized by any single group of people for any reason against other American citizens. And unfortunately, that's where we are. President Trump has that personal experience. He knows that very well.
Yeah. I read that FBI Director Kash Patel is petitioning to have a private phone line between himself and President Trump. He doesn't fully trust the FBI that he's now the head of. and all of the layers between him and the president. So we'll see where that ends up going. Another judge situation. Pete Hegseth has been tasked with running U.S. defense. He and Trump have decided transgender servicemen and women are a distraction. The hormonal situation could be detrimental. Taxpayer-funded surgeries are inappropriate use of taxpayer money. But now a Biden-appointed judge named Anna Reyes has ordered Pete Hegseth to take down all social media posts referencing trans anything, and is trying to unwind Trump and Hegseth's efforts with trans Americans in the military. Is this a lower court interfering in military matters and trying to block the commander-in-chief?
For 50 years, they're members of the U.S. government. They were at one time what I would call members of the loony left. Now they have reproduced, and they include many people who posture as Republicans and conservatives. And they have set out to systematically undermine and destroy discipline inside the armed forces. You have these separate courts now that people are advocating to deal with so-called sexual abuse or sexual aggression cases. In other words, taking more and more authority away from the chain of command, from the organization itself, and intervening in these matters. Look, here's the bottom line. The United States military establishment is not about individuals. You know, I hear people say, well, Mary was a soldier and she did this and so forth. It's not about Mary. It's about formations. When you fight as part of a formation. That formation to survive must not have weak links. It must be cohesive. It must be well-trained, correctly equipped, and highly disciplined. You don't take a vote in combat whether or not you're going to attack the enemy. If the enemy is out there and you're tasked to go find it and kill it, that's what you do. You don't take a vote when you're defending an area from enemy attack as to whether or not you will fire a missile, shoot down an incoming aircraft. You do it. These are all about formations, batteries of missiles, batteries of artillery systems, batteries or companies, troops consisting of tanks, infantry, whatever it is. What supports the formation in the prosecution of its mission is good. What detracts from the prosecution of that mission is bad. It is the formation that counts. If forcing numbers of young women into an organization who are between the ages of 18 and 25 makes people on the Hill happy and feel good, is irrelevant to the military. The question is, introducing small numbers of young women into a combat formation of, say, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 800, 900 men, is that a healthy thing? Is it a good thing? Does it help the formation fight, or does it detract? We have seen numerous studies over many, many years that demonstrate very conclusively it detracts. It is not supportive of good discipline, cohesion, and morale. The same thing is true for these transgender cases. People who suffer from gender dysphoria. They can do what they like in the civilian world. In the private sector, all things are possible, I guess. But in the military, that doesn't work. Otherwise, you have no military establishment. And when I look at the American military establishment today, and I see large numbers of young men and women who are grossly overweight, who are not in shape, who obviously couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag, I think there's a serious problem. That's just one symptom, but it's part of a larger problem. The armed forces are undisciplined. They're not ready to fight anyone on a moment's notice. They're not ready for the kind of warfare that we've seen in eastern Ukraine. And that is kill or be killed warfare at close range and at long range. We're not ready for it. And that's a problem. And Hegseth is up against that. And the president of the United States, I think, knows that. And he's up against it. The Hill is unhelpful. Civilians on the outside who feel nothing but contempt for those of us who are in the professional military are not going to help us. But someone has to insulate us from this deteriorating situation inside the society. We have to have high standards, because if we don't have high standards, we admit people that are not fit mentally or physically to fight. We risk losing badly in a confrontation at sea, in the air, or on the ground. That's the problem.
Would it help if high schools and junior highs went back to making physical education a bigger part? I see these old films from what high school was like in the 40s and 50s. People are doing pull-ups, they're running, mazes, they're doing all this stuff. It seems like it was making sure that men were healthy, strong, high testosterone, ability to fight or make more babies. And now it's just very, very soft. Is that where it needs to start? Because otherwise, I don't know that Pete Hegseth has much material to work with.
Well, that's a legitimate question. I think there is good human material out there. There may not be as much of it as we would like at this point in time, because we've seen this feminization of men. We've seen the emasculation of men. Anything that smacks of aggressiveness in a man in any way, shape, or form is treated as a disease that needs to be cured. That's a social problem. But in the military, we can't be bothered solving those problems. We have to do what is necessary to build and field effective forces. And men do not want to be led into combat by Pee Wee Herman or any number of other strange characters that come out of Hollywood. They want to be able to respect and admire officers who lead from the front, officers who are willing to lay down their lives on the battlefield, officers that are fit, intelligent, and demonstrate competence. That's what soldiers expect. At the same time, officers must demand that the soldiers they lead are in equally good physical condition as they are. We cannot put up with large numbers of fat people because we're told, well, that's all you're going to get. From the very beginning of this terrible nightmare that we're in right now, I have always said, if we have to get smaller, let's get smaller, but let's get better. Let's not get worse. Well, we've gotten a lot worse. We need to get a hell of a lot better. And if that means that we take in fewer and fewer survive the initial period of time called basic training or advanced individual training, and they can't make the grade, that's fine. If we start with 100 and we end up with 20, at least we know those 20 will be good soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines who can do their jobs properly under pressure in combat. That's what we want.
Okay. This is my 5th year of covering politics. I've never seen Democrats work so hard in my life, but it's not for abortion. It's not for lowering taxes. It's not for illegal immigrants. It's to keep corrupt programs like USAID, corruption within Social Security going. Do you find it odd that they are fighting so hard to keep fraud versus being disgusted that it exists?
No, not at all. I've watched them for years. And whenever you try to explain what's really happening, that USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, as example, are actively subverting other people's governments, that they are intruding in other people's societies and introducing LGBTQ programs and actions that those societies resist and do not want, they scoff at you. The problem is that we've got a large number of people now on the Hill that are convinced that they have a monopoly on truth, that whatever they say or do is righteous, and whatever anyone who objects to what they want to do is fundamentally bad, and therefore is unacceptable. This has led us down a very, very dangerous road of decay and deterioration. Our forces are weak, not because we don't have good technology. We could use some new infusions of different technologies. No one disputes that, but it's weak because of the human capital problem. And that's what we have to develop, and that's what we have to build. It's the same thing if you go into most of the public high schools. How many people are graduating in many public high schools every year in large urban areas that are functionally illiterate? Well, then why do we graduate them? Why do we confer a high school degree on someone who can barely read and write? Well, we're told that that's necessary. Why is that necessary? We have to be very clear about what we're trying to produce. We don't need to produce people who are frankly incapable of performing effectively within our societies. If they cannot perform effectively through the normal system, we have to build new systems that will find them employment, that will prepare them for something else. We've resisted this for decades. Go read the the bell curve. Go read any number of books on this subject. I think it was Irving Kristol that wrote a book about the destruction of Western education. There are so many out there. People have been warning us for years, for decades, of this problem. Everyone's turned a deaf ear to it. And it's the notion that everyone gets a gold star. Doesn't matter what you do, whether or not you perform, you get a gold star. Why? Why? To make everyone feel good, make everyone feel equal. Well, here's a newsflash. We are not all the same. The only place where we enjoy equality, or should enjoy it, is in a court of law. That's where equality counts. And that's not equity, that's equality before the law. In other words, an equal chance for justice. That's where we are today. It's no longer an equal chance for justice, because the people that you are describing that are responsible for these disastrous programs that export chaos and frankly destruction overseas have done a terrible lot of damage to us here at home. And so there is no chance for excellence. And instead of reinforcing excellence, we are reinforcing failure. That has to stop.
Okay. I know we're up against the clock, so I have just a couple more questions here.
I'm sorry for ranting and raving. I apologize.
No, I love it. This idea of tariffs on paper sounds really good. As I do research, I can see why Trump wants to move in this direction. He sees the abuse of taxes on the American people over the last 100 years. I believe he really is trying to be a change agent for good. But your thoughts on, does he really want to annex Canada, or is this just part of how he negotiates in order to get what he wants on the border, to slow fentanyl, to equalize trade and make it more fair? Your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I think the president very definitely wants trade to be fair. He wants it to be mutually beneficial. The problem with a tariff is always a double-edged sword. It cuts in two directions. It cuts at home and it cuts overseas. And they have to be used, tariffs, very judiciously, not carelessly. The second issue is what's changed in the world since 2020, and I would argue a great deal. If you look at China, for instance, 4, 5, 6 years ago, China was actually vulnerable in many areas to tariffs by us. They aren't anymore. In fact, they've adjusted their trade relations, and their big markets are no longer the United States. It's the rest of the world, Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And this is not going to change. So if you think you're going to punish China and prevent them from acquiring the natural resources, the energy resources, the material resources they need to be productive, you're wasting your time. That can't be done. So you have to think carefully about how you proceed. If you think that China is going to dump goods and destroy you, well, then you could put up barriers to prevent that. But you can't necessarily prevent China from doing business elsewhere. The Chinese are about business. They're ruthless. They're very competent business people. They go where the money is. That's it. And if they do business with you, they're trying to make money. We need to understand that. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are richly deserving of being attacked with American military power. They're not. It's not about military power. It's about business, economics, and resources. Today, if you look at the market, if you tried to take away $1 trillion from China, They've got a $1.5 million or $5 trillion export surplus elsewhere. It has nothing to do with us. It's not going to work. So I don't know how far he can go and how far he can be reasonably successful. We'll see. He thinks they can go a long way. We'll have to see. It may not be possible. It's the same thing that you're dealing with in eastern Ukraine. Russia is the power that has won the war. It's their backyard. They're going to determine what it looks like, not us, just as we will determine what does or does not happen long term in Central America. And that's why what happens in Mexico and Central America is so important to us. It's why we have to be engaged there. I think President Trump understands that. Again, this is the world that we live in is different today. The notion that we enjoy global hegemony in economic or military terms is an illusion. We don't have it. We shouldn't strive for it. We don't need it. We can be irresistibly powerful as we like, to the point where nobody is going to risk attacking us. That we can achieve. But the notion that we can dictate outcomes, economic outcomes, financial outcomes, military outcomes, political outcomes all over the world, that's misleading. Those days are over.
It's interesting as I study the United States and China. China has just become so wealthy by avoiding war and focusing on business. And I think Trump, even RFK Jr., when he was running, said, you know, we need to pull back and really focus on becoming an economic powerhouse. That's the way to dominate for the next 100 years, not through military, blunt force, things like that. Okay.
Well, if you go back to World War II and look at the United States, we were a production giant. In other words, we had the factories, we had the scientific industrial base, we had the human capital. All of this was present. And it catapulted us to global power, made us the mainstay of the whole global economy. Just look at the gross domestic product and the percentages we represented after World War II, all through the 50s and 60s and early 70s. Those days are over. The world has recovered. But China is going through something similar to what we went through in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This huge burst of energy and power. Now, it's never permanent. It's not permanent for us. It won't be permanent for them. But we have to understand what it means. And you don't cope with this or deal with it by going to war. The British Empire went to war stupidly against Germany, largely because Germany was this economic juggernaut. In 1914, by 1900, Germany had surpassed everyone in the world in terms of steel production except the United States. Go and look at steel production, look at energy production, all of these things, and Britain was afraid. Britain could have accommodated Germany. It could have benefited from Germany, and the Germans wanted to do business with the British. But Britons decided to try and destroy Germany because they saw it as a dangerous competitor. What was the outcome? Britain was destroyed. Germany recovered after World War I. Britain did not. And World War II finished Britain off completely when it did not have to do that. It did not have to sacrifice everything, its national power, its status in the world. And we are now very much like Great Britain. We're at a point now where, depending upon what we do, we will either survive and flourish by accommodating, compromising, and recognizing that the world has changed. We live in a different world and we can do business with everybody, but we can ultimately tinker with the trade relations. We can have an impact there to make sure that it's mutually beneficial. Or we can go to war, in which case we will be destroyed much as Britain was.
Okay. Colonel Macgregor, I know you got a busy day ahead of you. Thank you so much for taking time out to come and speak with me and my community.